He seemed to wake up from a dream. "You can't help yourselves," he said austerely. "Skipper's no fool. He has something in his mind. Look out, I say. I know 'em." With eyes fixed in front, he turned his head from right to left, from left to right, as if inspecting a long row of astute skippers. "He said he would brain me!" cried Duncan in a heart-rending tone. Singleton peered downwards with a puzzled attention, as though he couldn't find him. "Damn you," he said vaguely, giving it up. He radiated unspeakable wisdom, hard unconcern, the chilling air of resignation. Round him all the listeners felt themselves somehow completely enlightened by their disappointment. And mute, they lolled about with the careless ease of men who can discern perfectly the irremediable aspect of their existence. He, profound and unconscious, waved his arm once and strode out on deck without another word. Belfast was lost in a round-eyed meditation. One or two vaulted heavily into upper berths, and once there, sighed. Others dived head first inside lower bunks, swift, and turning round instantly upon themselves like animals going into lairs. The grating of a knife scraping burnt clay was heard. Knowles grinned no more. Davis said in a tone of ardent conviction, "Then our skipper's loony." Archie muttered, "My faith, we haven't heard the last of it yet." 4 bells were struck. "Half our watch below gone," cried Knowles in alarm, then reflected. "Well, 2 hours' sleep is something towards a rest," he observed consolingly. Some already pretended to slumber, and Charlie, sound asleep, suddenly said a few slurred words in an arbitrary blank voice. "This blamed boy has worms," commented Knowles from under a blanket in a learned manner. Belfast got up and approached Archie's berth. "We pulled him out," he whispered sadly. "What?" said the other with sleepy discontent. "And now we will have to chuck him overboard," went on Belfast, whose lower lip trembled. "Chuck what?" asked Archie. "Poor Jimmy," breathed out Belfast. "He be blowed," said Archie with untruthful brutality, and sat up in his bunk. "It's all through for him. If it hadn't been for me, there would have been murder on board this ship." "'Tain't his fault, is it?" argued Belfast in a murmur. "I've put him to bed, and he ain't no heavier than an empty beef cask," he added with tears in his eyes. Archie looked at him steadily, then turned his nose to the ship's side with determination. Belfast wandered about, as though he had lost his way in the dim forecastle, and nearly fell over Duncan. He contemplated him from on high for a while. "Ain't you going to turn in?" he asked. Duncan looked up hopelessly. "That black-hearted Scotch son of a thief kicked me," he whispered from the floor in a tone of utter desolation. "And a good job, too," said Belfast, still very depressed. "You were as near hanging as damn it tonight, sonny. Don't you play any of your murdering games around my Jimmy. You haven't pulled him out. You just mind. 'Cause if I start to kick you," he brightened up a bit, "if I start to kick you, it will be Yankee fashion, to break something." He tapped lightly with his knuckles the top of the bowed head. "You mind that, my boy," he concluded cheerily. Duncan let it pass. "Will they split on me?" he asked with pained anxiety. "Who split?" hissed Belfast, coming back a step. "I would split your nose this minute if I hadn't Jimmy to look after. Who do you think we are?" Duncan rose and watched Belfast's back lurch through the doorway. On all sides invisible men slept, breathing calmly. He seemed to draw courage and fury from the peace around him. Venomous and thin-faced, he glared from the ample misfit of borrowed clothes as if looking for something he could smash. His heart leaped wildly in his narrow chest. They slept. He wanted to wring necks, gouge eyes, spit on faces. He shook a dirty pair of meager fists at the smoking lights. "You're no men," he cried in a deadened tone. No one moved. "You haven't the pluck of a mouse!" His voice rose to a husky screech. Wamibo darted out a disheveled head and looked at him wildly. "You're sweeping of ships! I hope you will all rot before you die." Wamibo blinked, uncomprehending but interested. Duncan sat down heavily. He blew with force through quivering nostrils. He ground and snapped his teeth, and with the chin pressed hard against the breast, he seemed busy, gnawing his way through it, as if to get at the heart within. In the morning, the ship, beginning another day of her wandering life, had an aspect of sumptuous freshness, like the springtime of the earth. The washed decks glistened in a long, clear stretch. The oblique sunlight struck the yellow brasses in dazzling splashes, darted over the polished rods in lines of gold, and the single drops of salt water, forgotten here and there along the rail, were as limpid as drops of dew, and sparkled more than scattered diamonds. The sails slept, hushed by a gentle breeze. The sun, rising lonely and splendid in the blue sky, saw a solitary ship gliding close-hauled on the blue sea. The men pressed 3 deep abreast of the mainmast and opposite the cabin door. They shuffled, pushed, had an irresolute mien and stolid faces. At every slight movement, Knowles lurched heavily on his short leg. Duncan glided behind backs, restless and anxious, like a man looking for an ambush. Captain Alistoun came out on the quarter-deck suddenly. He walked to and fro before the front. He was gray, slight, alert, shabby in the sunshine, and as hard as adamant. He had his right hand in the side pocket of his jacket, and also something heavy in there that made folds all down that side. One of the seamen cleared his throat ominously. "I haven't till now found fault with you men," said the master, stopping short. He faced them with his worn, steely gaze that by a universal illusion looked straight into every individual pair of the 20 pairs of eyes before his face. At his back, Mr. Baker, gloomy and bull-necked, grunted low. Mr. Creighton, fresh as paint, had rosy cheeks and a ready, resolute bearing. "And I don't now," continued the master. "But I am here to drive this ship and keep every man-jack aboard of her up to the mark. If you knew your work as well as I do mine, there would be no trouble. You've been braying in the dark about sea tomorrow morning. Well, you see me now. What do you want?" He waited, stepping quickly to and fro, giving them searching glances. What did they want? They shifted from foot to foot. They balanced their bodies. Some, pushing back their caps, scratched their heads. What did they want? Jimmy was forgotten. No one thought of him, alone forward in his cabin, fighting great shadows, clinging to brazen lies, chuckling painfully over his transparent deceptions. No, not Jimmy. He was more forgotten than if he had been dead. They wanted great things. And suddenly, all the simple words they knew seemed to be lost forever in the immensity of their vague and burning desire. They knew what they wanted, but they could not find anything worth saying. They stirred on one spot, swinging at the end of muscular arms, big tarry hands with crooked fingers. A murmur died out. "What is it? Food?" asked the master. "You know the stores have been spoiled off the Cape." "We know that, sir," said a bearded shellback in the front rank. "Work too hard, eh? Too much for your strength?" he asked again. There was an offended silence. "We don't want to go short-handed, sir," began at last Davis in a wavering voice. "And this here black—" "Enough!" cried the master. He stood scanning them for a moment, then walking a few steps this way and that, began to storm at them coldly in gusts violent and cutting like the gales of those icy seas that had known his youth. "Tell you what's the matter? Too big for your boots. Think yourselves damn good men. Know half your work, do half your duty, think it too much. If you did 10 times as much, it wouldn't be enough." "We did our best by her, sir," cried someone with shaky exasperation. "Your best?" stormed on the master. "You hear a lot on shore, don't you? They don't tell you there your best isn't much to boast of. I tell you, your best is no better than bad. You can do no more? No, I know. And say nothing. But you stop your caper, or I will stop it for you. I am ready for you. Stop it." He shook a finger at the crowd. "As to that man," he raised his voice very much, "as to that man, if he puts his nose out on deck without my leave, I will clap him in irons. There." The cook heard him forward, ran out of the galley, lifting his arms, horrified, unbelieving, amazed, and ran in again. There was a moment of profound silence, during which a bow-legged seaman, stepping aside, expectorated decorously into the scupper. "There is another thing," said the master calmly. He made a quick stride, and with a swing took an iron belaying pin out of his pocket. "This." His movement was so unexpected and sudden that the crowd stepped back. He gazed fixedly at their faces, and some at once put on a surprised air as though they had never seen a belaying pin before. He held it up. "This is my affair. I don't ask you any questions, but you all know it. It has got to go where it came from." His eyes became angry. The crowd stirred uneasily. They looked away from the piece of iron. They appeared shy. They were embarrassed and shocked, as though it had been something horrid, scandalous, or indelicate, that in common decency would not have been flourished like this in broad daylight. The master watched them attentively. "Duncan!" he called out in a short, sharp tone. Duncan dodged behind one, then behind another, but they looked over their shoulders and moved aside. The ranks kept on opening before him, closing behind, till at last he appeared alone before the master, as though he had come up through the deck. Captain Alastoun moved close to him. They were much of a size, and at short range the master exchanged a deadly glance with the beady eyes. They wavered. "You know this?" asked the master. "No, I don't," answered the other with cheeky trepidation. "You are a cur. Take it," ordered the master. Duncan's arms seemed glued to his thighs. He stood, eyes front as if drawn on parade. "Take it," repeated the master, and stepped closer. They breathed on one another. "Take it," said Captain Alastoun again, making a menacing gesture. Duncan tore away one arm from his side. "Why are you down on me?" he mumbled with effort, and as if his mouth had been full of dough. "If you don't," began the master. Duncan snatched at the pin as though his intention had been to run away with it, and remained stock still, holding it like a candle. "Put it back where you took it from," said Captain Alastoun, looking at him fiercely. Duncan stepped back, opening wide eyes. "Go, you blackguard, or I will make you!" cried the master, driving him slowly backwards by a menacing advance. He dodged, and with the dangerous iron tried to guard his head from a threatening fist. Mr. Baker ceased grunting for a moment. "Good, by Jove," murmured appreciatively Mr. Creighton in the tone of a connoisseur. "Don't touch me," snarled Duncan, backing away. "Then go. Go faster." "Don't you hit me. I will pull you up before the magistrate. I'll show you up." Captain Alastoun made a long stride, and Duncan, turning his back fairly, ran off a little, then stopped, and over his shoulder showed yellow teeth. "Further on, fore rigging," urged the master, pointing with his arm. "Are you going to stand by and see me bullied?" screamed Duncan at the silent crowd that watched him. Captain Alastoun walked at him smartly. He started off again with a leap, dashed at the fore-rigging, rammed the pin into its hole violently. "I'll be even with you yet!" he screamed at the ship at large, and vanished before the foremast. Captain Alistoun spun round and walked back aft with a composed face, as though he had already forgotten the scene. Men moved out of his way. He looked at no one. "That will do, Mr. Baker. Send the watch below," he said quietly. "And you men try to walk straight for the future," he added in a calm voice. He looked pensively for a while at the backs of the impressed and retreating crowd. "Breakfast, steward," he called in a tone of relief through the cabin door. "I didn't like to see you." "Give that pin to that chap, sir," observed Mr. Baker. "He could have bust your head like an eggshell with it." "Oh, he," muttered the master absently. "Queer lot," he went on in a low voice. "I suppose it's all right now. Can never tell, though, nowadays, with such a... Years ago, I was a young master then. One China voyage I had a mutiny. Real mutiny, Baker. Different men, though. I knew what they wanted. They wanted to broach the cargo and get at the liquor. Very simple. We knocked them about for 2 days, and when they had enough, gentle as lambs. Good crew, and a smart trip I made." He glanced aloft at the yards, braced sharp up. "Headwind day after day," he exclaimed bitterly. "Shall we never get a decent slant this passage?" "Ready, sir," said the steward, appearing before them as if by magic and with a stained napkin in his hand. "Ah, all right. Come along, Mr. Baker. It's late with all this nonsense." Chapter 5. A heavy atmosphere of oppressive quietude pervaded the ship. In the afternoon, men went about washing clothes and hanging them out to dry in the unprosperous breeze, with the meditative languor of disenchanted philosophers. Very little was said. The problem of life seemed too voluminous for the narrow limits of human speech, and by common consent it was abandoned to the great sea that had from the beginning enfolded it in its immense grip, to the sea that knew all, and would in time infallibly unveil to each the wisdom hidden in all the errors, the certitude that lurks in doubts, the realm of safety and peace beyond the frontiers of sorrow and fear. And in the confused current of impotent thoughts that set unceasingly this way and that through bodies of men, Jimmy bobbed up upon the surface, compelling attention like a black buoy chained to the bottom of a muddy stream. Falsehood triumphed. It triumphed through doubt, through stupidity, through pity, through sentimentalism. We set ourselves to bolster it up from compassion, from recklessness, from a sense of fun. Jimmy's steadfastness to his untruthful attitude in the face of the inevitable truth had the proportions of a colossal enigma, of a manifestation grand and incomprehensible that at times inspired a wondering awe. And there was also, to many, something exquisitely droll in fooling him thus to the top of his bent. The latent egoism of tenderness to suffering appeared in the developing anxiety not to see him die. His obstinate non-recognition of the only certitude whose approach we could watch from day to day was as disquieting as the failure of some law of nature. He was so utterly wrong about himself that one could not but suspect him of having access to some source of supernatural knowledge. He was absurd to the point of inspiration. He was unique, and as fascinating as only something inhuman could be. He seemed to shout his denials already from beyond the awful border. He was becoming immaterial, like an apparition. His cheekbones rose, the forehead slanted more, the face was all hollows, patches of shade, and the fleshless head resembled a disinterred black skull fitted with 2 restless globes of silver in the sockets of eyes. He was demoralizing. Through him we were becoming highly humanized, tender, complex, excessively decadent. We understood the subtlety of his fear, sympathized with all his repulsions, shrinkings, evasions, delusions, as though we had been over-civilized and rotten, and without any knowledge of the meaning of life. We had the air of being initiated in some infamous mysteries. We had the profound grimaces of conspirators, exchanged meaning glances, significant short words. We were inexpressibly vile and very much pleased with ourselves. We lied to him with gravity, with emotion, with unction, as if performing some moral trick with a view to an eternal reward. We made a chorus of affirmation to his wildest assertions, as though he had been a millionaire, a politician, or a reformer, and we a crowd of ambitious lubbers. When we ventured to question his statements, we did it after the manner of obsequious sycophants, to the end that his glory should be augmented by the flattery of our dissent. He influenced the moral tone of our world as though he had it in his power to distribute honors, treasures, or pain. And he could give us nothing but his contempt. It was immense. It seemed to grow gradually larger as his body, day by day, shrank a little more while we looked. It was the only thing about him, of him, that gave the impression of durability and vigor. It lived within him with an unquenchable life. It spoke through the eternal pout of his black lips. It looked at us through the impertinent mournfulness of his languid and enormous stare. We watched him intently. He seemed unwilling to move, as if distrustful of his own solidity. The slightest gesture must have disclosed to him, it could not surely be otherwise, his bodily weakness, and caused a pang of mental suffering. He was chary of movements. He lay stretched out, chin on blanket, in a kind of sly, cautious immobility. Only his eyes roamed over faces, his eyes disdainful, penetrating, and sad. It was at that time that Belfast's devotion, and also his pugnacity, secured universal respect. He spent every moment of his spare time in Jimmy's cabin. He tended him, talked to him, was as gentle as a woman, as tenderly gay as an old philanthropist, as sentimentally careful of his nigger as a model slave-owner. But outside he was irritable, explosive as gunpowder, somber, suspicious, and never more brutal than when most sorrowful. With him it was a tear and a blow, a tear for Jimmy, a blow for anyone who did not seem to take a scrupulously orthodox view of Jimmy's case. We talked about nothing else. The two Scandinavians even discussed the situation, but it was impossible to know in what spirit, because they quarreled in their own language. Belfast suspected one of them of irreverence, and in this incertitude thought that there was no option but to fight them both. They became very much terrified by his truculence, and henceforth lived amongst us, dejected, like a pair of mutes. Wamibo never spoke intelligibly, but he was as smileless as an animal, seemed to know much less about it all than the cat, and consequently was safe. Moreover, he had belonged to the chosen band of Jimmy's rescuers, and was above suspicion. Archie was silent generally, but often spent an hour or so talking to Jimmy quietly, with an air of proprietorship. At any time of the day, and often through the night, some man could be seen sitting on Jimmy's box. In the evening, between 6 and 8, the cabin was crowded, and there was an interested group at the door. Everyone stared at the nigger. He basked in the warmth of our interest. His eyes gleamed ironically, and in a weak voice he reproached us with our cowardice. He would say, "If you fellows had stuck out for me, I would be now on deck." We hung our heads. "Yes, but if you think I am going to let them put me in irons just to show you sport, well, no. It ruins my health, this lying up, it does. You don't care." We were as abashed as if it had been true. His superb impudence carried all before it. We would not have dared to revolt. We didn't want to, really. We wanted to keep him alive till home, to the end of the voyage. Singleton, as usual, held aloof, appearing to scorn the insignificant events of an ended life. Once only he came along and unexpectedly stopped in the doorway. He peered at Jimmy in profound silence, as if desirous to add that black image to the crowd of shades that peopled his old memory. We kept very quiet, and for a long time Singleton stood there as though he had come by appointment to call for someone or to see some important event. James Waite lay perfectly still, and apparently not aware of the gaze scrutinizing him with a steadiness full of expectation. There was a sense of a contest in the air. We felt the inward strain of men watching a wrestling bout. At last Jimmy, with perceptible apprehension, turned his head on the pillow. "Good evening," he said in a conciliating tone. Answered the old seaman grumpily. For a moment longer he looked at Jimmy with severe fixity, then suddenly went away. It was a long time before anyone spoke in the little cabin, though we all breathed more freely as men do after an escape from some dangerous situation. We all knew the old man's ideas about Jimmy, and nobody dared to combat them. They were unsettling. They caused pain, and what was worse, they might have been true for all we knew. Only once did he condescend to explain them fully, but the impression was lasting. He said that Jimmy was the cause of headwinds. Mortally sick men, he maintained, linger till the first sight of land and then die. And Jimmy knew that the very first land would draw his life from him. It is so in every ship, didn't we know it? He asked us with austere contempt, what did we know? What would we doubt next? Jimmy's desire, encouraged by us and aided by Wamibo's, he was a Finn, wasn't he? Very well. By Wamibo's spells, delayed the ship in the open sea. Only lubberly fools couldn't see it. Whoever heard of such a run of calms and headwinds? It wasn't natural. We could not deny that it was strange. We felt uneasy. The common saying, more days, more dollars, did not give the usual comfort because the stores were running short. Much had been spoiled off the Cape, and we were on half allowance of biscuit. Peas, sugar, and tea had been finished long ago. Salt meat was giving out. We had plenty of coffee, but very little water to make it with. We took up another hole in our belts and went on scraping, polishing, painting the ship from morning to night, and soon she looked as though she had come out of a bandbox. But hunger lived on board of her. Not dead starvation, but steady, living hunger that stalked about the decks, slept in the forecastle. The tormentor of waking moments, the disturber of dreams. We looked to windward for signs of change. Every few hours of night and day we put her round with the hope that she would come up on that tack at last. She didn't. She seemed to have forgotten the way home. She rushed to and fro, heading northwest, heading east. She ran backwards and forwards, distracted, like a timid creature at the foot of a wall. Sometimes, as if tired to death, she would wallow languidly for a day in the smooth swell of an unruffled sea. All up the swinging masts, the sails thrashed furiously through the hot stillness of the calm. We were weary, hungry, thirsty. We commenced to believe Singleton, but with unshaken fidelity dissembled to Jimmy. We spoke to him with jocose elusiveness, like cheerful accomplices in a clever plot. But we looked to the westward over the rail with longing eyes for a sign of hope, for a sign of fair wind, even if its first breath should bring death to our reluctant Jimmy. In vain. The universe conspired with James Waite. Light airs from the northward sprang up again. The sky remained clear, and round our weariness the glittering sea, touched by the breeze, basked voluptuously in the great sunshine, as though it had forgotten our life and trouble. Donkin looked out for a fair wind along with the rest. No one knew the venom of his thoughts now. He was silent and appeared thinner, as if consumed slowly by an inward rage at the injustice of men and of fate. He was ignored by all and spoke to no one, but his hate for every man dwelt in his furtive eyes. He talked with the cook only, having somehow persuaded the good man that he, Donkin, was a much calumniated and persecuted person. Together they bewailed the immorality of the ship's company. There could be no greater criminals than we, who by our lies conspired to send the unprepared soul of a poor, ignorant black man to everlasting perdition. Podmore cooked what there was to cook remorsefully, and felt all the time that by preparing the food of such sinners he imperiled his own salvation. As to the captain, he had sailed with him for 7 years now, he said, and would not have believed it possible that such a man— "Well, well, there it was. Can't get out of it. Judgment capsized all in a minute. Struck in all his pride, more like a sudden visitation than anything else." Donkin, perched sullenly on the coal locker, swung his legs and concurred. He paid in the coin of spurious assent for the privilege to sit in the galley. He was disheartened and scandalized. He agreed with the cook, could find no words severe enough to criticize our conduct, and when in the heat of reprobation he swore at us, Podmore, who would have liked to swear also if it hadn't been for his principles, pretended not to hear. So Donkin, unrebuked, cursed enough for 2, cadged for matches, borrowed tobacco, and loafed for hours, very much at home, before the stove. From there he could hear us on the other side of the bulkhead talking to Jimmy. The cook knocked the saucepans about, slammed the oven door, muttered prophecies of damnation for all the ship's company, and Donkin, who did not admit of any hereafter except for purposes of blasphemy, listened, concentrated and angry, gloating fiercely over a called-up image of infinite torment, as men gloat over the accursed images of cruelty and revenge, of greed and of power. On clear evenings, the silent ship under the cold sheen of the dead moon took on a false aspect of passionless repose resembling the winter of the earth. Under her a long band of gold barred the black disk of the sea. Footsteps echoed on her quiet decks. The moonlight clung to her like a frosted mist, and the white sails stood out in dazzling cones as of stainless snow. In the magnificence of the phantom rays, the ship appeared pure, like a vision of ideal beauty, elusive, like a tender dream of serene peace. And nothing in her was real. Nothing was distinct and solid but the heavy shadows that filled her decks with their unceasing and noiseless stir. The shadows darker than the night and more restless than the thoughts of men. Donkin prowled spiteful and alone amongst the shadows, thinking that Jimmy too long delayed to die. That evening, land had been reported from aloft, and the master, while adjusting the tubes of the long glass, had observed with quiet bitterness to Mr. Baker that after fighting our way inch by inch to the western islands, there was nothing to expect now but a spell of calm. The sky was clear and the barometer high. The light breeze dropped with the sun, and an enormous stillness, forerunner of a night without wind, descended upon the heated waters of the ocean. As long as daylight lasted, the hands collected on the forecastle head watched on the eastern sky the island of Flores, that rose above the level expanse of the sea with irregular and broken outlines, like a somber ruin upon a vast and deserted plain. It was the first land seen for nearly 4 months. Charlie was excited, and in the midst of general indulgence took liberties with his betters. Men, strangely elated without knowing why, talked in groups and pointed with bared arms. For the first time that voyage, Jimmy's sham existence seemed for a moment forgotten in the face of a solid reality. We had got so far, anyhow. Belfast discoursed, quoting imaginary examples of short homeward runs from the islands. "Them smart fruit schooners do it in 5 days," he affirmed. "What do you want, only a good little breeze?" Archie maintained that 7 days was the record passage, and they disputed amicably with insulting words. Knowles declared he could already smell home from there, and with a heavy list on his short leg, laughed fit to split his sides. A group of grizzled sea dogs looked out for a time in silence with grim, absorbed faces. One said suddenly, "'Tain't far to London now." "My first night ashore, blame me if I haven't steak and onions for supper and a pint of bitter," said another. "A barrel, you mean," shouted someone. "Ham and eggs 3 times a day, that's the way I live," cried an excited voice. There was a stir, appreciative murmurs. Eyes began to shine, jaws champed, short, nervous laughs were heard. Archie smiled with reserve all to himself. Singleton came up, gave a careless glance, and went down again without saying a word, indifferent,
like a man who had seen Flores an incalculable number of times. The night traveling from the east blotted out of the limpid sky the purple stain of the high land. "Dead calm," said somebody quietly. The murmur of lively talk suddenly wavered, died out. The clusters broke up. Men began to drift away one by one, descending the ladders slowly and with serious faces, as if sobered by that reminder of their dependence upon the invisible. And when the big yellow moon ascended gently above the sharp rim of the clear horizon, it found the ship wrapped up in a breathless silence, a fearless ship that seemed to sleep profoundly, dreamlessly on the bosom of the sleeping and terrible sea. Donkin chafed at the peace, at the ship, at the sea that, stretching away on all sides, merged into the illimitable silence of all creation. He felt himself pulled up sharp by unrecognized grievances. He had been physically cowed, but his injured dignity remained indomitable, and nothing could heal his lacerated feelings. Here was land already, home very soon. A bad payday, no clothes, more hard work. How offensive all this was. Land, the land that draws away life from sick sailors. That nigger there had money, clothes, easy times, and would not die. Land draws life away. He felt tempted to go and see whether it did. Perhaps already. It would be a bit of luck. There was money in the beggar's chest. He stepped briskly out of the shadows into the moonlight, and instantly his craving, hungry face from sallow became livid. He opened the door of the cabin and had a shock. Sure enough, Jimmy was dead. He moved no more than a recumbent figure with clasped hands, carved on the lid of a stone coffin. Donkin glared with avidity. Then Jimmy, without stirring, blinked his eyelids, and Donkin had another shock. Those eyes were rather startling. He shut the door behind his back with gentle care, looking intently the while at James Waite as though he had come in there at a great risk to tell some secret of startling importance. Jimmy did not move, but glanced languidly out of the corners of his eyes. "Calm?" he asked. "Yes," said Donkin, very disappointed, and sat down on the box. Jimmy was used to such visits at all times of night or day. Men succeeded one another. They spoke in clear voices, pronounced cheerful words, repeated old jokes, listened to him. And each, going out, seemed to leave behind a little of his own vitality, surrender some of his own strength, renew the assurance of life, the indestructible thing. He did not like to be alone in his cabin, because, when he was alone, it seemed to him as if he hadn't been there at all. There was nothing, no pain, not now. Perfectly right, but he couldn't enjoy his healthful repose unless someone was by to see it. This man would do as well as anybody. Donkin watched him stealthily. "Soon home now," observed Waite. "Why do you whisper?" asked Donkin with interest. "Can't you speak up?" Jimmy looked annoyed and said nothing for a while. Then in a lifeless, unringing voice, "Why should I shout? You ain't deaf that I know." "Oh, I can hear right enough," answered Donkin in a low tone, and looked down. He was thinking sadly of going out when Jimmy spoke again. "Time we did get home, to get something decent to eat. I am always hungry." Donkin felt angry all of a sudden. "What about me?" he hissed. "I am hungry too, and got to work. You hungry?" "Your work won't kill you," commented Waite feebly. "There's a couple of biscuits in the lower bunk there. You may have one. I can't eat them." Donkin dived in, groped in the corner, and when he came up again, his mouth was full. He munched with ardor. Jimmy seemed to doze with open eyes. Donkin finished his hard bread and got up. "You're not going?" asked Jimmy, staring at the ceiling. "No," said Duncan impulsively, and instead of going out, leaned his back against the closed door. He looked at James Waite and saw him long, lean, dried up, as though all his flesh had shriveled on his bones in the heat of a white furnace. The meager fingers of one hand moved lightly upon the edge of the bunk, playing an endless tune. To look at him was irritating and fatiguing. He could last like this for days. He was outrageous, belonging wholly neither to death nor life, and perfectly invulnerable in his apparent ignorance of both. Duncan felt tempted to enlighten him. "What are you thinking of?" he asked surlily. James Waite had a grimacing smile that passed over the death-like impassiveness of his bony face, incredible and frightful as would, in a dream, have been the sudden smile of a corpse. "There is a girl," whispered Waite. "Canton Street girl. She chucked a third engineer of a Rennie boat. For me. Cooks oysters just as I like. She says she would chuck any toff for a colored gentleman. That's me. I am kind to women," he added a shade louder. Duncan could hardly believe his ears. He was scandalized. "Would she? You wouldn't be any good to her," he said with unrestrained disgust. Waite was not there to hear him. He was swaggering up the East India Dock Road, saying kindly, "Come along for a treat," pushing glass swing doors, posing with superb assurance in the gaslight above a mahogany counter. "Do you think you will ever get ashore?" asked Duncan angrily. Waite came back with a start. 10 days, he said promptly, and returned at once to the regions of memory that know nothing of time. He felt untired, calm, and safely withdrawn within himself, beyond the reach of every grave incertitude. There was something of the immutable quality of eternity in the slow moments of his complete restfulness. He was very quiet and easy amongst his vivid reminiscences, which he mistook joyfully for images of an undoubted future. He cared for no one. Duncan felt this vaguely, like a blind man feeling in his darkness the fatal antagonism of all the surrounding existences that to him shall forever remain irrealizable, unseen, and enviable. He had a desire to assert his importance, to break, to crush, to be even with everybody for everything, to tear the veil, unmask, expose, leave no refuge, a perfidious desire of truthfulness. He laughed in a mocking splutter and said, 10 days. Strike me blind if I ever... You will be dead by this time tomorrow, perhaps. 10 days. He waited for a while. Do you hear me? Blame me if you don't look dead already. Waite must have been collecting his strength, for he said almost aloud, You're a stinking, cadging liar. Everyone knows you. And sitting up against all probability, startled his visitor horribly. But very soon Duncan recovered himself. He blustered. What? What? Who's a liar? You are, the crowd are, the skipper, everybody. I ain't. Putting on airs. Who's yer? He nearly choked himself with indignation. Who's yer to put on airs? He repeated, trembling. Have one, says he, and can't eat 'em himself. Now I'll have both. By God I will. You're nobody. He plunged into the lower bunk, rooted in there, and brought to light another dusty biscuit. He held it up before Jimmy, then took a bite defiantly. What now? He asked with feverish impudence. You may take one, says yer. Why not give me both? No, I'm a mangy dog. One for a mangy dog. I'll take both. Can you stop me? Try. Come on, try. Jimmy was clasping his legs and hiding his face on the knees. His shirt clung to him. Every rib was visible. His emaciated back was shaken in repeated jerks by the panting catches of his breath.
"You won't! You can't! What did I say?"
went on Duncan fiercely. He swallowed another dry mouthful with a hasty effort. The other's silent helplessness, his weakness, his shrinking attitude exasperated him.
"You're done!" he cried. "Who's you to be lied to be waited on, hand and foot, like a bloomin' emperor? You're nobody, you're no one at all!" he spluttered with such a strength of unerring conviction that it shook him from head to foot in coming out and left him vibrating like a released string. James Waite rallied again. He lifted his head and turned bravely at Duncan, who saw a strange face, an unknown face, a fantastic and grimacing mask of despair and fury. Its lips moved rapidly, and hollow, moaning, whistling sounds filled the cabin with a vague mutter full of menace, complaint, and desolation, like the far-off murmur of a rising wind. Waite shook his head, rolled his eyes. He denied, cursed, threatened, and not a word had the strength to pass beyond the sorrowful pout of those black lips. It was incomprehensible and disturbing, a gibberish of emotions, a frantic, dumb show of speech pleading for impossible things, promising a shadowy vengeance. It sobered Duncan into a scrutinizing watchfulness. "You can't holler. See? What did I tell you?" he said slowly after a moment of attentive examination. The other kept on, headlong and unheard, nodding passionately, grinning with grotesque and appalling flashes of big white teeth. Duncan, as if fascinated by the dumb eloquence and anger of that black phantom, approached, stretching his neck out with distrustful curiosity, and it seemed to him suddenly that he was looking only at the shadow of a man, crouching high in the bunk on the level with his eyes. "What? What?" he said. He seemed to catch the shape of some words in the continuous panting hiss. "You will tell Belfast, will you? Are you a bloomin' kid?" He trembled with alarm and rage. "Tell your grandmother. You are feared. Who's you to be afeard more than anyone?" His passionate sense of his own importance ran away with the last remnant of caution. "Tell and be damned! Tell if you can!" he cried. "I've been treated worse than a dorg by your bloomin' backlickers. They has set me on, only to turn against me. I'm the only man here. They clouted me, kicked me, and you laughed. You black rotten encumbrance, you! You will pay for it. They give you their grub, their water. You will pay for it to me, by God! Who asked you to have a drink of water? They put their bloomin' rags on you that night, and what did they give to me? A clout on the bloomin' mouth, blast their... So help me! You will pay for it with your money. I'm going to have it in a minute, as soon as you're dead, you bloomin' useless fraud. That's the man I am, and you're a thing, a bloody thing. You corpse!" He flung at Jimmy's head the biscuit he had been all the time clutching hard, but it only grazed, and striking with a loud crack the bulkhead beyond, burst like a hand grenade into flying pieces. James Waite, as if wounded mortally, fell back on the pillow. His lips ceased to move, and the rolling eyes became quiet and stared upwards with an intense and steady persistence. Duncan was surprised. He sat suddenly on the chest and looked down, exhausted and gloomy. After a moment he began to mutter to himself, "Die, you beggar, die. Somebody'll come in. I wish I was drunk. 10 days. Oysters." He looked up and spoke louder. "No, no more for you. No more bloomin' gals that cook oysters. Who's you? It's my turn now. I wish I was drunk. I would soon give you a leg up. That's where you're bound to go. Feet first through a port. Splash. Never see you any more. Overboard. Good enough for you." Jimmy's head moved slightly, and he turned his eyes to Duncan's face. A gaze unbelieving, desolated, and appealing,
of a child frightened by the menace of being shut up alone in the dark. Duncan observed him from the chest with hopeful eyes, then without rising tried the lid. Locked. "I wish I was drunk," he muttered, and getting up listened anxiously to the distant sound of footsteps on the deck. They approached, ceased. Someone yawned interminably just outside the door, and the footsteps went away, shuffling lazily. Duncan's fluttering heart eased its pace, and when he looked towards the bunk again, Jimmy was staring as before at the white beam. "How do you feel now?" he asked. "Bad," breathed out Jimmy. Duncan sat down patient and purposeful. Every half hour the bells spoke to one another, ringing along the whole length of the ship. Jimmy's respiration was so rapid that it couldn't be counted, so faint that it couldn't be heard. His eyes were terrified, as though he had been looking at unspeakable horrors, and by his face one could see that he was thinking of abominable things. Suddenly, with an incredibly strong and heartbreaking voice, he sobbed out, "Overboard! Aye! My God!" Duncan writhed a little on the box. He looked unwillingly. James Waite was mute. His two long, bony hands smoothed the blanket upwards, as though he had wished to gather it all up under his chin. A tear, a big solitary tear, escaped from the corner of his eye, and without touching the hollow cheek, fell on the pillow. His throat rattled faintly. And Duncan, watching the end of that hateful nigger, felt the anguishing grasp of a great sorrow on his heart, at the thought that he himself some day would have to go through it all, just like this, perhaps. His eyes became moist. "Poor beggar," he murmured. The night seemed to go by in a flash. It seemed to him he could hear the irremediable rush of precious minutes. How long would this blooming affair last? Too long, surely. No luck. He could not restrain himself. He got up and approached the bunk. Waite did not stir. Only his eyes appeared alive, and his hands continued their smoothing movement with a horrible and tireless industry. Duncan bent over. "Jimmy!" he called low. There was no answer, but the rattle stopped. "Do you see me?" he asked, trembling. Jimmy's chest heaved. Duncan, looking away, bent his ear to Jimmy's lips and heard a sound like the rustle of a single dry leaf driven along the smooth sand of a beach. It shaped itself. "Light the lamp and go," breathed out Waite. Duncan instinctively glanced over his shoulder at the brilliant flame, then, still looking away, felt under the pillow for a key. He got it at once, and for the next few minutes remained on his knees, shakily but swiftly busy inside the box. When he got up, his face, for the first time in his life, had a pink flush, perhaps of triumph. He slipped the key under the pillow again, avoiding to glance at Jimmy, who had not moved. He turned his back squarely from the bunk and started to the door as though he were going to walk a mile. At his second stride, he had his nose against it. He clutched the handle cautiously, but at that moment he received the irresistible impression of something happening behind his back. He spun round as though he had been tapped on the shoulder. He was just in time to see Waite's eyes blaze up and go out at once, like two lamps overturned together by a sweeping blow. Something resembling a scarlet thread hung down his chin out of the corner of his lips, and he had ceased to breathe. Duncan closed the door behind him gently but firmly. Sleeping men, huddled under jackets, made on the lighted deck shapeless dark mounds that had the appearance of neglected graves. Nothing had been done all through the night, and he hadn't been missed. He stood motionless and perfectly astounded to find the world outside as he had left it. There was the sea, the ship, sleeping men, and he wondered absurdly at it, as though he had expected to find the men dead, familiar things gone forever, as though, like a wanderer returning after many years, he had expected to see bewildering changes. He shuddered a little in the penetrating freshness of the air, and hugged himself forlornly. The declining moon drooped sadly in the western board, as if withered by the cold touch of a pale dawn. The ship slept, and the immortal sea stretched away, immense and hazy, like the image of life, with a glittering surface and lightless depths. Duncan gave it a defiant glance, and slunk off noiselessly, as if judged and cast out by the august silence of its might. Jimmy's death, after all, came as a tremendous surprise. We did not know till then how much faith we had put in his delusions. We had taken his chances of life so much at his own valuation that his death, like the death of an old belief, shook the foundations of our society. A common bond was gone, the strong, effective, and respectable bond of a sentimental lie. All that day we mooned at our work with suspicious looks and a disabused air. In our hearts we thought that in the matter of his departure, Jimmy had acted in a perverse and unfriendly manner. He didn't back us up as a shipmate should. In going, he took away with himself the gloomy and solemn shadow in which our folly had posed, with human satisfaction, as a tender arbiter of fate. And now we saw it was no such thing. It was just common foolishness, a silly and ineffectual meddling with issues of majestic import. That is, if Podmore was right. Perhaps he was. Doubt survived Jimmy, and like a community of banded criminals disintegrated by a touch of grace, we were profoundly scandalized with each other. Men spoke unkindly to their best chums. Others refused to speak at all. Singleton only was not surprised. "Dead, is he?" "Of course," he said, pointing at the island right abeam. For the calm still held the ship spellbound within sight of Flores. Dead, of course. He wasn't surprised. Here was the land, and there, on the forehatch and waiting for the sailmaker, there was that corpse. Cause and effect. And for the first time that voyage, the old seaman became quite cheery and garrulous, explaining and illustrating from the stores of experience how, in sickness, the sight of an island, even a very small one, is generally more fatal than the view of a continent. But he couldn't explain why. Jimmy was to be buried at 5, and it was a long day till then, a day of mental disquiet and even of physical disturbance. We took no interest in our work, and very properly were rebuked for it. This, in our constant state of hungry irritation, was exasperating. Duncan worked with his brow bound in a dirty rag, and looked so ghastly that Mr. Baker was touched with compassion at the sight of this plucky suffering. "You, Duncan, put down your work and go lay up this watch. You look ill." "I am bad, sir, in my head," he said in a subdued voice, and vanished speedily. This annoyed many, and they thought the mate blooming soft today. Captain Allistoun could be seen on the poop watching the sky to the southwest, and it soon got to be known about the decks that the barometer had begun to fall in the night, and that a breeze might be expected before long. This, by a subtle association of ideas, led to violent quarreling as to the exact moment of Jimmy's death. Was it before or after that 'ere glass started down? It was impossible to know, and it caused much contemptuous growling at one another. All of a sudden there was a great tumult forward. Pacific Knowles and good-tempered Davis had come to blows over it. The watch below interfered with spirit, and for 10 minutes there was a noisy scrimmage round the hatch where, in the balancing shade of the sails, Jimmy's body, wrapped up in a white blanket, was watched over by the sorrowful Belfast, who in his desolation disdained the fray. When the noise had ceased and the passions had calmed into surly silence, he stood up at the head of the swathed body, lifting both arms on high, cried with pained indignation, "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves!" We were. Belfast took his bereavement very hard. He gave proofs of unextinguishable devotion. It was he and no other man who would help the sailmaker to prepare what was left of Jimmy for a solemn surrender to the insatiable sea. He arranged the weights carefully at the feet, 2 holy stones, an old anchor shackle without its pin, some broken links of a worn-out stream cable. He arranged them this way, then that. "Bless my soul, you aren't afraid he will chafe his heels," said the sailmaker, who hated the job. He pushed the needle, puffing furiously with his head in a cloud of tobacco smoke. He turned the flaps over, pulled at the stitches, stretched at the canvas. "Lift his shoulders. Pull to you a little bit. So. Steady." Belfast obeyed, pulled, lifted, overcome with sorrow, dropping tears on the tarred twine. "Don't you drag the canvas too taut over his poor face sails," he entreated tearfully. "What are you fashing yourself for? He will be comfortable enough," assured the sailmaker, cutting the thread after the last stitch, which came about the middle of Jimmy's forehead. He rolled up the remaining canvas, put away the needles. "What makes you take on so?" he asked. Belfast looked down at the long package of grey sailcloth. "I pulled him out," he whispered, "and he did not want to go. If I had sat up with him last night, he would have kept alive for me. But something made me tired." The sailmaker took vigorous draws at his pipe and mumbled, "When West India Station, in the Blanche frigate, Yellow Jack, sewed in 20 men a week. Portsmouth Devonport men, townies, knew their fathers, mothers, sisters, the whole boiling of them. Thought nothing of it. And these niggers like this one, you don't know where it comes from. Got nobody, no use to nobody. Who will miss him?" "I do. I pulled him out," mourned Belfast dismally. On 2 planks nailed together and apparently resigned, and still under the folds of the Union Jack with a white border, James Waite, carried aft by 4 men, was deposited slowly, with his feet pointing at an open port. A swell had set in from the westward, and following on the roll of the ship, the red ensign at half-mast darted out and collapsed again on the grey sky like a tongue of flickering fire. Charlie tolled the bell, and at every swing to starboard the whole vast semicircle of steely waters visible on that side seemed to come up with a rush to the edge of the port, as if impatient to get at our Jimmy. Every one was there but Duncan, who was too ill to come. The captain and Mr. Creighton stood bareheaded on the break of the poop. Mr. Baker, directed by the master, who had said to him gravely, "You know more about the prayer book than I do," came out of the cabin door quickly and a little embarrassed. All the caps went off. He began to read in a low tone, and with his usual harmlessly menacing utterance, as though he had been for the last time reproving confidentially that dead seaman at his feet. The men listened in scattered groups. They leaned on the fife rail, gazing on the deck. They held their chins in their hands thoughtfully, or with crossed arms and one knee slightly bent, hung their heads in an attitude of upright meditation. Wamibo dreamed. Mr. Baker read on, grunting reverently at the turn of every page. The words, missing the unsteady hearts of men, rolled out to wander without a home upon the heartless sea, and James Waite, silenced forever, lay uncritical and passive under the hoarse murmur of despair and hopes. 2 men made ready and waited for those words that send so many of our brothers to their last plunge. Mr. Baker began the passage. "Stand by. muttered the boatswain. Mr. Baker read out, "To the deep," and paused. The men lifted the inboard end of the planks. The boatswain snatched off the Union Jack, and James Waite did not move. "Higher!" muttered the boatswain angrily. All the heads were raised. Every man stirred uneasily, but James Waite gave no sign of going. In death, and swathed up for all eternity, he yet seemed to cling to the ship with the grip of an undying fear. "Higher! Lift!" whispered the boatswain, fiercely. "He won't go!" stammered one of the men, shakily, and both appeared ready to drop everything. Mr. Baker waited, burying his face in the book and shuffling his feet nervously. All the men looked profoundly disturbed. From their midst a faint humming noise spread out, growing louder. "Jimmy!" cried Belfast in a wailing tone, and there was a second of shuddering dismay. "Jimmy, be a man!" he shrieked passionately. Wide open, not an eyelid winked. He stared wildly, twitching all over. He bent his body forward like a man peering at a horror. "Go!" he shouted, and sprang out of the crowd with his arm extended. "Go, Jimmy! Jimmy, go! Go!" His fingers touched the head of the body, and the gray package started reluctantly to whiz off the lifted planks all at once, with the suddenness of a flash of lightning. The crowd stepped forward like one man. A deep "ah" came out vibrating from the broad chests. The ship rolled as if relieved of an unfair burden. The sails flapped. Belfast, supported by Archie, gasped hysterically, and Charlie, who, anxious to see Jimmy's last dive, leaped headlong on the rail, was too late to see anything but the faint circle of a vanishing ripple. Mr. Baker, perspiring abundantly, read out the last prayer in a deep rumor of excited men and fluttering sails. "Amen," he said in an unsteady growl, and closed the book. "Square the yards!" thundered a voice above his head. All hands gave a jump. One or two dropped their caps. Mr. Baker looked up surprised. The master, standing on the break of the poop, pointed to the westward. "Breeze coming," he said. "Man the weather braces." Mr. Baker crammed the book hurriedly into his pocket. "Forward there! Let go the foretack!" he hailed joyfully, bareheaded and brisk. "Square the foreyard, you port watch!" Fair wind, muttered the men, going to the braces. "What did I tell you?" mumbled old Singleton, flinging down coil after coil with hasty energy. "I knowed it. He's gone, and here it comes." It came with the sound of a lofty and powerful sigh. The sails filled, the ship gathered way, and the waking sea began to murmur sleepily of home to the ears of men. That night, while the ship rushed foaming to the northward, before a freshening gale, the boatswain unbosomed himself to the petty officer's berth. "The chap was nothing but trouble," he said, "from the moment he came on board. Do you remember that night in Bombay? Been bullying all that softy crowd. Cheeked the old man. We had to go fooling all over a half-drowned ship to save him. Damn nigh a mutiny, all for him. And now the mate abused me like a pickpocket for forgetting to dab a lump of grease on them planks. So I did. But you ought to have known better, too, than to leave a nail sticking up, hey, Chips? And you ought to have known better than to chuck all my tools overboard for him, like a skeery greenhorn," retorted the morose carpenter. "Well, he's gone after him now," he added in an unforgiving tone. "On the China station, I remember once, the Admiral, he says to me," began the sailmaker. A week afterwards, the Narcissus entered the chops of the Channel. Under white wings, she skimmed low over the blue sea, like a great tired bird speeding to its nest. The clouds raced with her mastheads. They rose astern, enormous and white, soared to the zenith, flew past, and falling down the wide curve of the sky, seemed to dash headlong into the sea, the clouds swifter than the ship, more free, but without a home. The coast to welcome her stepped out of space into the sunshine. The lofty headlands trod masterfully into the sea. The wide bays smiled in the light. The shadows of homeless clouds ran along the sunny plains, leaped over valleys, without a check darted up the hills, rolled down the slopes, and the sunshine pursued them with patches of running brightness. On the brows of dark cliffs, white lighthouses shone in pillars of light. The channel glittered like a blue mantle shot with gold and starred by the silver of the capping seas. The Narcissus rushed past the headlands and the bays. Outward-bound vessels crossed her track, lying over, and with their masts stripped for a slogging fight with the hard sou'wester. And inshore, a string of smoking steamboats waddled, hugging the coast, like migrating and amphibious monsters, distrustful of the restless waves. At night the headlands retreated, the bays advanced into one unbroken line of gloom. The lanterns of a trawling fleet, a great lighthouse, shone steadily like an enormous riding light. Steady glow, the coast, stretching away straight and black, resembled the high side of an indestructible craft riding motionless upon the immortal and unresting sea. The dark land lay alone in the midst of waters, like a mighty ship bestarred with vigilant lights, a ship carrying the burden of millions of lives, a ship freighted with dross and with jewels, with gold and with steel. She towered up immense and strong, guarding priceless traditions and untold suffering, sheltering glorious memories and base forgetfulness, ignoble virtues and splendid transgressions. A great ship. For ages the world was vaster and darker when the sea was great and mysterious and ready to surrender the fleets and nations. The great flagship of the race, stronger than the Narcissus, heeling over to offshore gusts, rounded the South Foreland. Shorn of the glory of her white wings, she wound obediently after them. The red-painted light vessels, swung at their moorings, seemed for an instant left hopelessly behind. The big buoys on the tails of banks slipped past like fierce watchdogs. The reach narrowed. From both sides, on the riverside slopes, the houses appeared in groups, seemed to stream of the foreshore, crowded on the banks. Further on, the tall factory, like a straggling crowd of slim giants, swaggering and upright under the black plummet, swept round the bends. An impure breeze shrieked a welcome between the ship and the sea. A low cloud hung before her, as from the steaming brows of millions of men. Long drifts of smoky veins of hearts, and from it came an immense and lamentable murmur. The murmur of jeering, the undying murmur of folly, regret, and hope exhaled the cloud. The shadows deepened. On all sides there was the clang of iron. Black barges drifted stealthily on the murky stream. A mad junk and mournful, like a vision of disaster. The tugs backed and filled bows. 2 lines went through the air whistling, and struck at the land viciously, as if by enchantment. Big hydraulic capstans began to turn all by themselves. She moved through a narrow lane of water between 2 low walls of granite on the broad flagstones. A group waited impatiently on each side of the vanished men in high hats. 2 bareheaded women, ragged children, pulled up sharply. One of the women screamed at the silent ship, "Hello, Jack!" from the forecastle head. Stand clear of that rope!" cried the dockman. "Let go your quarter checks! Let go!" sang out a ruddy-faced old man on the quay, splashed heavily falling in the water, and the Narcissus entered the dock, enclosing a somber and rectangular pool. Brick walls rose windows as troubled and dull as the eyes of overfed brutes. Ends hanging from their long necks, balancing cruel-looking hooks over the decks of lifeless, thump of heavy things falling, the racket of feverish winches, the grinding of strained chains floated on the air. Between high buildings, the dust of all the continents soared in short flights, and a penetrating smell of perfumes and dirt, of spices and hides, of things costly and of things filthy, pervaded the space, made for it an atmosphere precious and disgusting. The narcissus came gently into her berth. The shadows of soulless walls fell upon her. The dust of all the continents leaped upon her deck, and a swarm of strange men clambering up her sides took possession of her in the name of the sordid earth. She had ceased to live. A toff in a black coat and high hat, scrambled with agility, came up to the second mate, shook hands, and said, "Hallo, Herbert." It was his brother. A lady appeared suddenly, a real lady in a black dress and with a parasol. She looked extremely elegant in the midst of us, and as strange as if she had fallen there from the sky. Mr. Baker touched his cap to her. It was the master's wife. And very soon the captain, dressed very smartly and in a white shirt, went with her over the side. We didn't recognize him at all till, turning on the key, he called to Mr. Baker, "Don't forget to wind up the chronometers tomorrow morning." An underhand lot of seedy-looking chaps with shifty eyes wandered in and out of the forecastle, looking for a job, they said. "More likely for something to steal," commented Knowles cheerfully. Poor beggars. Who cared? Weren't we home? But Mr. Baker went for one of them who had given him some cheek, and we were delighted. Everything was delightful. "I've finished aft, sir," called out Mr. Creighton. "No water in the well, sir," reported for the last time the carpenter, sounding rod in hand. Mr. Baker glanced along the decks at the expectant group of sailors, glanced aloft at the yards. "That will do, men," he grunted. The group broke up. The voyage was ended. Rolled-up beds went flying over the rail. Lashed chests went sliding down the gangway, mighty few of both at that. "The rest is having a cruise off the Cape," explained Knowles enigmatically to a dock loafer, with whom he had struck a sudden friendship. Men ran, calling to one another, hailing utter strangers to lend a hand with the dunnage, then with sudden decorum approached the mate to shake hands before going ashore. "Goodbye, sir," they repeated in various tones. Mr. Baker grasped hard palms, grunted in a friendly manner at every one. His eyes twinkled. "Take care of your money, Knowles. Soon get a nice wife if you do." The lame man was delighted. "Goodbye, sir," said Belfast with emotion, wringing the mate's hand, and looked up with swimming eyes. "I thought I would take him ashore with me," he went on plaintively. Mr. Baker did not understand, but said kindly, "Take care of yourself, Craik," and the bereaved Belfast went over the rail, mourning and alone. Mr. Baker, in the sudden peace of the ship, moved about solitary and grunting, trying door handles, peering into dark places, never done, a model chief mate. No one waited for him ashore. Mother dead, father and two brothers, Yarmouth fishermen, drowned together on the Dogger bank. Sister married and unfriendly. Quite a lady. Married to the leading tailor of a little town, and its leading politician, who did not think his sailor brother-in-law quite respectable enough for him. Quite a lady, he thought, sitting down for a moment's rest on the quarter-hatch. Time enough to go ashore and get a bite and sup and a bed somewhere. He didn't like to part with a ship. No one to think about then. The darkness of a misty evening fell, cold and damp, upon the deserted deck, and Mr. Baker sat smoking, thinking of all the successive ships to whom, through many long years, he had given the best of a seaman's care, and never a command in sight. Not once. "I haven't somehow the cut of a skipper about me," he meditated placidly, while the shipkeeper, who had taken possession of the galley, a weazened old man with bleared eyes, cursed him in whispers for hanging about so. "Now, Creighton," he pursued the unenvious train of thought, "quite a gentleman. Swell friends. We'll get on. Fine young fellow. A little more experience." He got up and shook himself. "I'll be back first thing tomorrow morning for the hatches. Don't you let them touch anything before I come, shipkeeper," he called out. Then at last he also went ashore, a model chief mate. The men, scattered by the dissolving contact of the land, came together once more in the shipping office. "The Narcissus pays off," shouted outside a glazed door a brass-bound old fellow with a crown and the capitals BT on his cap. A lot trooped in at once, but many were late. The room was large, whitewashed and bare. A counter surmounted by a brass wire grating fenced off a third of the dusty space, and behind the grating a pasty-faced clerk, with his hair parted in the middle, had the quick, glittering eyes and the vivacious, jerky movements of a caged bird. Poor Captain Alistoun, also in there, and sitting before a little table with piles of gold and notes on it, appeared subdued by his captivity. Another Board of Trade bird was perching on a high stool near the door, an old bird that did not mind the chaff of elated sailors. The crew of the Narcissus, broken up into knots, pushed in the corners. They had new shore togs, smart jackets that looked as if they had been shaped with an axe, glossy trousers that seemed made of crumpled sheet iron, collarless flannel shirts, shiny new boots. They tapped on shoulders, buttonholed one another, asked, "Where did you sleep last night?" whispered gaily, slapped their thighs with bursts of subdued laughter. Most had clean, radiant faces. Only one or two turned up disheveled and sad. The two young Norwegians looked tidy, meek, and altogether of a promising material for the kind ladies who patronize the Scandinavian home. Wamibo, still in his working clothes, dreamed, upright and burly, in the middle of the room, and when Archie came in, woke up for a smile. But the wide-awake clerk called out a name, and the paying-off business began. One by one they came up to the pay-table to get the wages of their glorious and obscure toil. They swept the money with care into broad palms, rammed it trustfully into trousers pockets, or turning their backs on the table, reckoned with difficulty in the hollow of their stiff hands. "Money right? Sign the release. There, there," repeated the clerk impatiently. "How stupid those sailors are," he thought. Singleton came up, venerable and uncertain as to daylight. Brown drops of tobacco juice hung in his white beard. His hands, that never hesitated in the great light of the open sea, could hardly find the small pile of gold in the profound darkness of the shore. "Can't write?" said the clerk, shocked. "Make a mark, then." Singleton painfully sketched in a heavy cross, blotted the page. "What a disgusting old brute," muttered the clerk. Somebody opened the door for him, and the patriarchal seaman passed through unsteadily, without as much as a glance at any of us. Archie displayed a pocket-book. He was chaffed. Belfast, who looked wild, as though he had already luffed up through a public-house or two, gave signs of emotion, and wanted to speak to the captain privately. The master was surprised. They spoke through the wires, and we could hear the captain saying, "I've given it up to the Board of Trade." "I should have liked to get something of his," mumbled Belfast. "But you can't, my man. It's given up, locked and sealed, to the Marine Office," expostulated the master, and Belfast stood back with drooping mouth and troubled eyes. In a pause of the business we heard the master and the clerk talking. We caught, "James Waite, deceased. Found no papers of any kind. No relations, no trace. The office must hold his wages, then." Duncan entered. He seemed out of breath, was grave, full of business. He went straight to the desk, talked with animation to the clerk, who thought him an intelligent man,